welcome to the first keynote of the fall council meetings. If you are not a council member, the councils are a community of like-minded product and UX, GM, and CEO leaders who share a passion for customer centricity and customer-led businesses, and who really come together to ask for help and be open and vulnerable and share with each other. Our theme for the fall meetings is hearts and minds, as some of you saw in today's newsletter. And I can't imagine a better person than Teresa Torres to kick us off. She has a great heart and a brilliant mind. As co-author of Customers Included and the 15-year CEO of Creative Good, I find Teresa's work and her book near and dear to my heart and mind, certainly. And another person I adore is today's host, Hope Gurian. Hope, like Teresa, is a longtime friend and member of the Collaborative Gain community, and she is the host of today's session. She'll do the full intro of Teresa Torres, although I think most of you know Teresa. Let me just say a few words about Hope so you know what good hands you're in. Hope is a former chief product officer herself and now coaches product teams and product leaders in achieving empowered, good word, product teams who practice continuous discovery, good phrase, in partnership with Teresa Torres. Hope is also, as mentioned, a longtime Collaborative Gain member, and now she's the moderator of the Great Product Leader Council 11. Hope, thank you for hosting today's fall keynote with Teresa Torres. It's so thrilling to have you both here. And I will now turn it over to you. And I'm excited to watch and learn from both of you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Phil. Yeah, so I'll just say a couple of words. Obviously, Phil's already done a great job introducing Teresa, and I know so many of you are already familiar with her and her work, but Teresa and I have known each other for many, many years now. I was one of the first people who reached out to her and was like, you write about a lot of the topics that my teams really struggle with. Can you help us? And luckily for me and my team, she was willing to do so. And since then, we've not only become good friends, but we also are now partners together, trying to help as many teams as possible really work in a way that really fulfills their hearts and their minds and gives them much more power and purpose in their work. So it's really rewarding work to do. One of the things that I think about when I think about Teresa, speaking of brilliant minds, is a quote that Albert Einstein is attributed to saying, which is, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think this is one of Teresa's great gifts, is that she understands discovery backwards and forwards at all levels in all organizations. She has taught over 7,000 product people these discovery skills. Obviously, she's written a book. The book is super accessible. You should have, many of you have a copy of it. And I think you'll also see from her talk today that she just understands this inside and out. And you're going to hear that in her talk today. And also I'm excited to help get all your questions answered from today's talk. She communicates simply, she communicates effectively. It helps teams make progress quickly. And I hope that's what you'll take away from her talk today. Be sure to ask questions in the Q&A so that we can get them answered. And again, I know you're already fans of Teresa, and you'll be even more so after today. So thanks, Teresa, for sharing your talk with us.
Oh, Hope, thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm literally like tearing up listening to you talk. What Hope didn't share is that she's responsible for introducing me to Collaborative Gain. She was a member and referred me to Phil, and I became a moderator of Council 11. And then when I had to step away, mostly to make time to write my book, Hope actually took over my council, and I'm seeing a lot of my old council members in the chat. So I'm super excited about this. It feels a little bit like a reunion. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the what and why of continuous discovery. I'm going to skip most of my intro since Phil and Hope already did a fantastic job. The one thing I will share is that the framework and the tools that I'm going to talk about have been tested in a lot of contexts. And that's because I've been really fortunate to work with teams all over the world, some as small as a 2-person founding team, others as big as multinational companies with hundreds of thousands of employees. The reason why I like to share that is I know what it's like to sit in an audience and think, oh, this will work for the Facebooks and the Netflix and the Googles, but it's never going to work in my organization. And so as we get started, I want you to consider either Hope or I, who actually teaches using my curriculum, have probably worked with a team just like yours. And so we all suffer from cognitive biases, and one of them is our default stance is, this won't work for me. So I want to encourage you to try to flip that on its head and think about, wow, this has worked for so many teams. How might it work for my team? Okay, with that caveat out of the way, let's dive in. So I'm going to start at the very beginning. If you're well-versed in discovery, don't worry, we're going to get some big ideas really quickly. When we talk about discovery, we often talk about it in contrast with delivery. Marty Kagan has done a great job of popularizing these terms. Discovery just refers to the work that we're doing to decide what to build, whereas delivery is the work that we're doing to build, ship, and maintain a production quality product. Now, these terms I think are really important because they give us language. A lot of companies put a big emphasis on delivery and we forget to put an equal emphasis on discovery. The other thing that we're doing with these terms do is they help highlight the shift we're seeing across the industry from a project mindset to a continuous mindset. We saw this first on the delivery side as companies worked towards continuous delivery or continuous deployment platforms. We're now seeing the same shift start to happen on the discovery side, where we're recognizing that digital products are never done. It's not like Facebook or Netflix are going to say, hey, our products are good enough, let's send our teams home, right? We're always iterating, we're always improving. And we're also recognizing that if we want to make good decisions about what to build, our customers need to be a part of that process. So today I'm going to talk about continuous discovery. I'm going to start with the definition because I know from working with dozens and dozens of teams, everybody shows up thinking they already do continuous discovery. So I want to give everybody a really clear benchmark to aspire to. And this definition does come from my book, Continuous Discovery Habits. I define continuous discovery as, at a minimum, weekly touch points with customers by the team building the product, where they're conducting small research activities in pursuit of a desired product outcome. Now, I know there's a lot here, so we're going to break it down line by line. This first line, weekly touch points with customers, it's really about how are we going to find this continuous cadence. And so I want to talk a little bit about why this is so important. So as product people, we're making product decisions every single day. Some of them are big strategic decisions, like which outcome should we go after? Which customer should we serve? Others are more sort of mundane everyday decisions, but equally important, like what do we label this button? How do we expose this feature in the interface? What should the underlying data model support? A lot of us know we should do some research for those big strategic decisions, but we forget that those daily decisions can also benefit from customer input. And there's a really important reason for this. When we work on our products all day, every day, we start to develop expertise about our product. We know where everything lives in the interface. We know what the product can do and not do. We know what order to do things. We know how to use our product because we're the ones building it. Our customers, unfortunately, don't have that depth of knowledge about our products. And so we start to run into this bias called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge basically says, as you develop expertise in a topic, you forget what it was like to not have that expert knowledge. And so as we go about making our daily decisions about how our product should work, we start making them from our expert point of view, and they stop working for our customers. Now, there's a really easy way to fix this. And this is why I encourage teams to engage with their customers more often. And the benchmark I like to give is try to talk to your customers at least once a week. Now, if this feels really overwhelming, you're nowhere close to this, we get to take a continuous improvement mindset to this. So if you've never talked to a customer, let's start by finding one customer to talk to. If you talk to them quarterly, maybe we can get to monthly. If you talk to them monthly, maybe we can get to every other week. The reason why I recommend aspiring to weekly is because we're making decisions every day. If we talk to customers at least once a week, we're going to get feedback on more of those decisions. The more often that we talk to customers, the more likely we're going to see the gap between how we think about the product and how our customers think about the product. And most of us When we see that gap, we're going to work really hard to overcome it, right? The problem is that we often don't see it at all. Now, there's another major advantage to this weekly cadence. For most of us that are still doing project-based discovery work, we're only doing validation research. So what do I mean by that? Validation research is we do all of the design. We have a pixel perfect production quality design prototype. And when we're done, we put it in front of users and we run some usability tests. Or we do all the delivery work. And when we're done, we A/B test it to validate, did we build the right thing? We should do validation research. The challenge with both methods is that we get feedback really late in the process where it's expensive and takes a ton of time to make changes, which means it's really hard to act on the feedback we're getting from our customers. With continuous discovery, we don't want to wait till we're done with all the design or wait until we're done with all the delivery. We actually want to get feedback continuously. We want to start getting feedback from customers when we have a half-baked idea, when we have a pencil sketch drawing. This helps us start to unlock a co-creation mindset. This is what's going to help us infuse our knowledge of what's possible with technology with our customers' knowledge of their own context, their own world, their own needs, pain points, and desires. This co-creation mindset is really powerful. I believe it's how we get to much better solutions. Now, some of you might be wondering, what about that Steve Jobs quote where he said, customers don't know what they want until we show it to them? Or maybe that Henry Ford quote where he allegedly said, if I had asked customers for what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So I want to be pretty clear here. When I say we should talk to our customers every week and we should co-create with them, I'm not suggesting we go to our customers and say, hey, what should we build? As we get more into the talk, we'll get into how do we ask better questions? What does that look like? Okay, so we've tackled this first line where it's really about a cadence, finding a continuous cadence to engaging with customers. Our goal in doing so is to close the gap between how we think about the product and how our customers think about the product. It's to help us not just do validation research, but to get feedback on half-baked ideas, on pencil sketches, and to really help us overcome that curse of knowledge. The second line by the team building the product is really critical. A lot of people, when they hear terms like dual track agile, they think there's a discovery team and a delivery team. So I can't emphasize this enough. The team that is building the product, so that is your delivery team, is the same team that is doing discovery. And it really starts with this idea of the product trio. So this concept has a lot of names. You might have heard it as a triad or a three-legged stool or the three amigos. It's really this idea of a product manager, a designer, and a software engineer working together from the very beginning to make decisions together about what they should be building. And that this is the same trio that's also leading the delivery effort. We're not handing off from a discovery team to a delivery team. And I want to contrast this with what we've historically done, right? Historically in a waterfall world, or as Mike likes to call a lot of Scrum processes, a mini waterfall world, we see the product manager write requirements, they hand them off to the designer does all the design work, and then both get handed off to the engineers. Here's the challenge with this. It's like a game of telephone. So if you remember that game from elementary school where kids whisper into each other's ears, at the end of the line, the kid has to say what he heard, and it sounds nothing like what the first kid said. That's what's happening with all these handoffs. What inevitably happens is some business stakeholder is talking to a customer. They turn around and communicate that to the product manager. They write up requirements. It gets communicated to the designer. By the time it gets to the engineers, it looks nothing like what the customer originally said. And we end up surprised that we built the wrong thing, right? So this idea of a trio is let's cut all of that out. Let's just get the cross-functional roles that are represented on our product team together from the beginning so that we make better decisions. We get less rework, we get less handoffs. Now, most of us have more than 3 roles on our team. You probably have additional engineers. Depending on your DevOps strategy, you might have QA folks or release managers on your team. Depending on how your product teams interface with the rest of the business, they might have data analysts, product marketing folks, customer success folks. Maybe you have the luxury of having a user researcher on your team. So one thing I want to emphasize with the idea of a product trio, we're not trying to exclude anybody. We're making a trade-off between the speed of decision-making and the quality of decision-making. So the more people involved in any decision, the slower you're going to go. However, the more relevant, keyword being relevant, cross-functional roles represented, the better decision that you'll make. So the idea of the trio is we're looking at what's our cross-functional collaborative team that needs to drive our decision-making process. And this idea can flex based on the roles available on your team or the types of decisions that you're trying to make. So if you have a user researcher that's embedded on your product team, you might always have a quad instead of a trio. If you're working on your go-to-market strategy, you might temporarily invite your product marketing manager to be a part of those discovery decisions. So this idea of the trio is not rigid. It really can flex based on your organizational context and based on the types of decisions that you're making. But because it's the trio that's leading discovery, it's the trio that's making decisions about what to build, we want to make sure that they're the ones engaging with customers on a weekly basis. They're the ones that need to overcome this curse of knowledge. So now I want to get into the second half of this definition, and this is where we're going to get into the meat of what does the work of discovery look like. So our goal is to conduct small research activities. I want to emphasize small. We're not going to take our old project-based research methods and try to jam them into a weekly cadence. And our goal is to do those small research activities to help us pursue a desired product outcome. So we're not doing research for research's sake. We're doing research to create customer value and business value. And it's those last two lines it's that last piece, aligning customer value and business value, that is often the hardest. So this is where I like to introduce a visual called the opportunity solution tree. I designed this visual to help a team chart the best path to the desired outcome. It's a way to stay focused on both customer value and business value. It starts by defining a clear outcome. And I like to talk about the outcome as representing business value. So I'm going to use Netflix as my example. I will share that I have never worked with Netflix. They don't sponsor me. I'm just sure that every single person on this call is familiar with how Netflix works. And so they're a good example. So let's imagine that Netflix they have a whole bunch of different product teams. They have a subscriber business model. They probably have teams focused on increasing subscriber retention. That's a key metric for a subscription business. Now, the challenge with telling a product team to increase retention is that's a business model metric that a lot of people in the company influence. So we want to do the work to translate that to a product outcome. A product outcome measures a behavior in the product. And so we need a theory of how can the product help us drive this business outcome. You can imagine at Netflix that their theory is that if you watch Netflix more, you're going to be more likely to retain. That's simple. So the product team might focus on driving viewing engagement with the belief that if they do that, that will drive retention. So that's our outcome, and it's meant to represent business value. So by increasing subscriber retention, we're measuring an increase in business value. Okay, now here's the challenge. I want to contrast this with what we've historically done and what many of you may still be doing. We historically told our teams, here's a roadmap. Here's a list of features, go build it. That's an output world, right? The one silver lining of COVID that I'm really excited about is the whole world got a giant dose of reality of how uncertain and how ambiguous and how quickly the world can change. And if you started January 2020 with a fixed roadmap, I'm pretty sure by March of 2020, you had to throw it out the door. What we get from a shift from outputs to outcomes is we get more agility. If you were focused on impact, nothing changed in Netflix world when they talked about increasing subscriber retention or increasing viewing engagement. Those were stable. What they built to support each might have changed in response to COVID. But by focusing on outcomes, it gives us some stability to better react to what's happening in the world around us. Now, if our outcome represents business value, we do want to also be customer-centric. And so we're going to look at how do we discover the opportunities that have the potential to drive our outcome. And an opportunity simply represents a customer need, a customer pain point, a customer desire. If you're familiar with the jobs to be done in the world, jobs tend to be high-level opportunities. We're looking at how can we create value for our customer. And the key here is we're only going to look at the opportunities that have the potential to drive our business outcome. And this is really important because the opportunity space is infinite and we can get distracted creating customer value that won't in turn drive business value. We want to make sure we're aligning these two things. Now, outputs still matter in this world. We do have to discover the solutions that have the potential to deliver, to address those opportunities in a way that will drive our business outcome. Okay, so let's get into the how. How are we building out this visual? What does this look like? In an ideal world, I want to see outcome setting be a negotiation between your product leader and your product trio. Your product leader is your chief product officer, your vice president of product, maybe your director of product in a larger company. If you're a collaborative gain member listening, you are probably the product leader. And if you are a team member on this call, you're probably a member of a product trio. The reason why we want this to be a two-way negotiation is we want the product leader to communicate how the team can drive business value. And we want the product trio to translate that, probably with help from that leader, into a product outcome. And then there's a negotiation about how much impact by when, given the resources that you have, you think you can achieve. Once the outcome is in place, we're now going to interview to discover opportunities. Now, a lot of teams think about interviewing as a way to get feedback on our solutions. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I really want to frame interviewing as a way to discover the opportunity space. And because the opportunity space is always changing, I like to see teams adopt a continuous cadence to interviewing and interview a customer at least once a week. The reason why most teams don't do this is recruiting is a significant barrier. It's hard to find people to talk to week after week. And so I do recommend that you invest a little bit of time in automating your recruiting process. So I've worked with dozens, if not hundreds of teams who have done this, where they show up to work on Monday morning, they look at the calendar, there's already a customer interview on their calendar without them having to do anything. I'm going to briefly share some strategies. The book goes into much more detail. The first is you can recruit people while they're using your product or service. This works exceptionally well for B2C companies and to recruit B2B end users. If you pursue this strategy, you have to think about it like a product funnel, and you're going to have to optimize it. Where do you show it? Who do you show it to? How much time do you ask for? What do you offer as a reward? How far out do you schedule? There's a lot of variables to play with, but the vast majority of teams that I've worked with are using this method to automate their recruiting process. For our B2B buyers or decision makers that aren't using our product all day, every day, we can use our customer-facing teams to have them help recruit. So by customer-facing teams, I mean anybody who's on the phone with your customers all day, every day. You can define triggers and say, if you're talking to a customer who has this specific need, ask them to do an interview with our product team and let them put it directly on your calendar. I'm going to share that 98% of the time, that's a made up metric, but it's pretty close is my guess. The teams are using one of these two strategies. I'm going to introduce a third one, but I'm going to caveat it. I only want you using these strategies in one of two situations. The third strategy. The first is if you have a teeny tiny total addressable market. I'm going to give two examples. I worked with a company. In fact, we might have some people from this company in our audience today. Their target customer is large US-based movie studios. I think there's something like 6 of them in their total addressable market. I worked with another company where their total addressable market was like a dozen Canadian medical schools, right? So we're talking about teeny tiny total addressable markets, or your customer is extremely hard to reach. Now, everybody thinks their customer is extremely hard to reach. So I'm going to give some examples. I'm talking about Fortune 500 CEOs that are not going to just wander by or call your support teams. Or, for example, respiratory ICU physicians and nurses during the height of COVID. So when we talk about hard to reach audiences, I'm talking about really hard to reach audiences. In those instances, you can set up a customer advisory board where you're building a long-term relationship with a small number of customers. The reason why I caveat this option is that if you have a large addressable market, or if you can talk to a wide variety of customers, you're much better off, because the risk of this strategy is that you're going to build a product for a very small subset of your market that isn't going to work for the whole market. So if you have to rely on this method to get started, that's fine, but you want to very quickly start adopting one of the other two methods. Okay, once we have a customer in the room, and by the way, I know we're going to cover a lot of ground really quickly. I'm going to tell you at the end how you can dig in and learn more about this. So once you have a customer in the room, we need to ask the right questions. So we already talked about, we're not going to ask, what should we build, right? That's our job. And our goal in an interview is to avoid speculation. And this is harder than it sounds. So we're going to stick with our Netflix example. If I were to interview Hope and say, hey, Hope, I might want to know things like, what do you like to watch on Netflix? Who do you watch with? What device do you watch on? How do you decide what to watch? But if I ask Hope these questions directly, here's what's going to happen. Her brain is going to give her fast answers. That's, I believe, system 1 for Kahneman fans out there, right? She's going to get fast answers. The challenge is, because she didn't trigger system 2, and there's no need to, we're just talking about Netflix, she didn't take the time to reflect on her actual behavior, and her answers aren't necessarily going to reflect her behavior in reality. And if you question this, I want you to know we all think we're all above average drivers. We all think we're above average listeners. We all think we eat healthier than we do. We all think we work out more than we do. We're optimistic about our behavior. We're certainly optimistic about our future behavior. So the key here to avoid this is to ground our interviews in specific stories about past behavior. So I don't want to say, Hope, what do you like to watch? I don't even want to say, tell me about your experience on Netflix. That's a good open-ended, non-leading question, but it's still really speculative because I'm not grounding her in a specific instance. So I want to say, Hope, tell me about the last time you watched Netflix. Now I can play with that question. I can say, tell me about the last time you had to choose a new show. Tell me about the last time you searched for something. Tell me about the last time you watched on a mobile device. So depending on what I'm trying to learn, I can play with that question. But the key is to keep the interview grounded in specific stories. That's going to increase the reliability of what you hear. It's also going to help you identify opportunities because needs, pain points, and desires emerge from our customer stories. And they emerge in a given context. So now we know more about the need. We know the environment in which they occur. It makes them more solvable. So as we interview weekly, we're going to map out the opportunity space. We don't have time today to get into opportunity mapping. It is a critical skill. It's going to help you get a big picture view of how you can reach your outcome. It's going to help you break big, hard opportunities into smaller opportunities, which will help you find your continuous cadence. But the key here is I want to see teams work on one opportunity at a time. And when they do that, I want to see them working with a set of solutions. So we're looking at what are our 3 best ideas for how we could address this customer need. Now, I'm guessing that's not what most of you do, and I'm not picking on you because I didn't do this for most of my career as well. What we tend to do is we hear a customer need and we jump to our first solution, right? And if we're discovery minded, we know that we need to test that idea, we need to prototype it, we need to get feedback. The challenge is as we do those activities, we're asking the wrong question. We're asking, is this idea good or not? And this framing is really problematic. Decision-making researchers tell us that when we frame our questions this way, we fall prey to the escalation of commitment, which is a bias that basically says the more we invest in an idea, the more we fall in love with the idea. And we fall prey to confirmation bias, where we're more likely to see the evidence that says our idea is fantastic and completely miss the evidence that suggests our idea is flawed. Again, there's a really easy way to avoid this. And that's simply to set up a compare and contrast decision where we're going to ask a better question. We're going to work with a set of solutions and we're going to say which of these solutions looks most promising. This trains your brain to look for the pros and cons of each of the ideas, and you will make a better decision. Most of us already know this. When we buy a house, we don't look at one house. When we get a new job, we don't interview or talk to one company, right? But we forget about it in our daily work. Now, this idea is important enough. I'm going to give you a visual to help you remember it. It's a little dated now that we just had a Summer Olympics, but bear with me. This is Usain Bolt. He was once the world's fastest 100-meter runner. If you saw him running around a track by himself, and I asked you, is he fast? I want you to hear a whether or not question and ask fast relative to what? Is he fast relative to a cheetah? Probably not. Is he fast relative to a Tesla? In the first 100 meters, I would pay to see that race. Is he fast relative to other humans? Absolutely. So what we're seeing in the photo on the right is a compare and contrast decision with a clear front runner. So if you or your teams have ever ran an experiment and wondered, are these results good enough or not? Or they've done a prototype test and they've wondered, is this feedback good enough or not? You're falling into this trap of a whether or not question. What we need to be doing is comparing and contrasting prototypes and saying which one looks like the front runner. The reason why we don't do this is because most of us are doing project-based research for our discovery, and we don't have time to do project-based research for 3 different ideas. So I'm going to introduce our second research activity. Our first was interviewing every week. The second is assumption testing. I want to see teams assumption testing every week to quickly evaluate sets of ideas. And I'm going to walk you through how this works. We're going to continue with our Netflix example. We're going to imagine that you interviewed Netflix users, you heard over and over again, I want to watch live sports. We're going to make this even more specific. I want to watch the Olympics because we just had the Olympics. I'm going to come up with 3 solutions. First, I could integrate NBC, a live feed of NBC directly into the Netflix interface. This would allow me to watch the Olympics live in Netflix. Second solution, I'm going to partner with the Olympic Committee and I'm going to license sporting events from the Olympics, just like we license movies from movie studios, and I'm going to integrate it into Netflix. Third solution, we're Netflix, we're not good at sports. Let's partner with somebody who already is. Fubo TV is another streaming service. They've already partnered with all the cable channels. They're pretty good at sports. Let's just bundle our subscriptions. Okay, we have 3 different solutions. We want to compare and contrast. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to take our solutions and we're going to break them down into their underlying assumptions. And we're going to rapidly test those assumptions. Now, this is not a new idea. It is currently September 28th, 2021. I believe in November of 2011, the Lean Startup came out, and Eric Ries talked a lot about testing assumptions. Why don't we do this today? It's very hard to see our own assumptions. We believe so strongly in our ideas that when we ask what assumptions need to be true for this idea to work, we draw a blank. So I'm going to give you a few ways to surface assumptions so you know what to test. I'm guessing many of you have seen this Venn diagram. It's become really popular in the product world. We talk about building desirable, viable, feasible products. I'm going to add 2 more categories, but I want to highlight we tend to make assumptions in 5 categories. So we make desirability assumptions. Why do we think our customers will want this? And why do we think they'll be willing to do what we need them to do to get value from it? We also make viability assumptions. Why do we think this will be good for our business? If we're an outcome-driven team, this is as simple as why do we think building this solution will address our opportunity in a way that will drive our outcome? We make feasibility assumptions. The technology exists. We have the skills and abilities required to deliver this solution. 4th category that I'm going to add we're pretty good at, and that's usability assumptions. Can people find it? Are they able to do what we need them to do? Do they understand the interface? 5th category we're less good at, and I'm going to be releasing way more content on this category over the next year, and that's ethical assumptions. Is there any potential harm in building this solution? This is where we should be looking at our data gathering policies, how we're storing that data, how we're using that data, who we're selling it to, how they're using it. Do our customers understand that? Are they okay with it? This recent uproar about Apple's change, where literally all they're doing is telling the consumer how your data is being used, and companies are upset with us, this tells us we're not being ethical, right? The other area we can explore here is in 2020, we saw a lot of social injustice and equity issues rise to the forefront. This is also where we can be looking at who do our products serve, who are we leaving out? Sometimes it's as simple as almost all of us live in parts of the world where we have good broadband connections, and it's easy to build products assuming we'll have a broadband connection. Who are we leaving out? People in rural areas, right? This could be you're a B2B company and you focus on enterprise customers because that's your large revenue. Who are we leaving out? Mom and pop businesses. Is that the type of world we want to create? It's also where we want to look at racial, ethnic, gender, able-bodiedness, all the other sort of ways that we tend to lump and design for the majority and leave out or underrepresented folks. Knowing these 5 categories will help you generate assumptions. You can ask, what are the desirability assumptions we're making? What are the ethical assumptions we're making? But you're still going to miss some. So I'm going to give you a second strategy for how to generate assumptions. And this is, we can story map to help us see our own assumptions. And I know that Jeff Patton a few years ago came and spoke to Collaborative Gain, and he did a whole workshop on story mapping. If you're not familiar with it, I'll briefly walk you through it. So the story map is the yellow boxes on this slide. And here's the key. We're going to fast forward in time and imagine our solution already exists. So in this case, we're going to imagine that Netflix has already partnered with NBC, and they're integrating a live feed of NBC into the Netflix interface. And we're going to ask, what does our customer have to do to get value from that NBC feed in the context of the opportunity I want to watch the Olympics, right? So what do we have to do? Our subscriber has to decide they want to watch a game or an event. They have to choose a streaming service. They have to open that streaming service. They have to choose a local channel. So they have to choose NBC, and then they have to watch NBC. Here's why this is valuable. For every yellow box on my slide, I can ask, what needs to be true in order for my subscriber to take that action? And below that, in the gray boxes, these are the assumptions that I'm making. So in order for a subscriber to want to watch a game, they have to be a sports fan, right? I'm assuming they're a sports fan. In order for them to choose Netflix, they have to know Netflix has sports. They have to want to watch sports on Netflix, not have a other provider they're happy with. In order for them to choose NBC, they have to know that the Olympics are on NBC. We have to be able to partner with NBC. We have to partner with NBC in a viable way, in a cost economical way. Those of you, everyone in the US is probably aware of our very archaic market region broadcast rights issues. So not only do we have to have access to NBC, but it can't be blacked out in our region. And then as we get into watching the event, now we're going to get into some of those feasibility assumptions, like Netflix can provide a great TV and movie streaming experience because they can buffer them. What happens when we buffer a live event and your buddy texts you about a soccer goal and you haven't watched it yet, right? So we're going to start to also surface some of those feasibility assumptions of, can we actually do this? Now, the value of doing this is that assumption testing is almost always faster than full idea testing. We can take a single assumption, and we typically want to shoot for our assumption test to take no more than a day or two. Some of our assumptions will be shared across all of our ideas. So for example, my 3 Netflix ideas all depend on this assumption that subscribers want to watch sports. They all depend on our subscribers want to watch sports on Netflix. If I test those assumptions early and I run into problems, I get to throw out not just the set of solutions, but the opportunity itself. Some of our assumptions differentiate our ideas from each other, right? The NBC idea depends on partnering with NBC. The Fubo TV idea depends on partnering with Fubo TV, etc. If I quickly test those assumptions, that's what's going to give me the compare and contrast data I need to make a better decision. Now, I'm going to very briefly, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, give you a couple of ways we can test assumptions. And if you want to know more about these methods, they are covered in depth in my book. So the first is we can prototype to simulate a very specific moment. This is not a full solution prototype. In this case, if I'm trying to test the assumption our subscribers want to watch sports, I could just give you a list of options and ask you, what do you want to watch right now? And I would expect some people to pick sports if they were sports fans. If I have access to an unmoderated testing tool, I can run this prototype test in less than a day. And because my test is teeny tiny, I can watch those videos very quickly and collect data about my assumption. The second way I can test this is I can run a very quick 1-question survey. 1-question surveys live within your product or service. You're getting people to give you input while you already have their attention. The key with surveys is we got to avoid those speculative questions and keep people grounded in their past behavior. So in this case, we're going to ask, have you watched a sporting event in the past week? We're looking for recency. We're looking for a pattern in behavior. As long as you have any traffic, you can usually collect enough survey responses in a day or two. If you have a lot of traffic, I've worked with a lot of teams that collect data in an hour. Very quick way to test an assumption. The third thing we can do is we can look at our existing data. We can ask, do we already have data that suggests our assumption is true? Are our customers already exhibiting behavior that tells us our assumption is true? In Netflix case, we might look at our search queries. Are people already searching for sports? Other sources of data we could look at depending on our assumption: behavioral analytics, support tickets, Salesforce notes on opportunities, search queries, page view traffic. We have all sorts of data we can draw from. The key question is, if your assumption was true, what behavior would you expect your customers to have? And then go look for evidence of that or evidence against that. Fourth way we can test our assumptions is for feasibility assumptions, as we often ask our engineers, go investigate. But we tend to not get specific enough. We tend to say, hey, just go figure out what it would take to build this. That's a very open-ended, unstructured problem, and we tend to get unreliable estimates back. So when I talk about using research spikes, which is just a time-boxed activity where you ask your engineers to go investigate something, I want you to give them a very specific feasibility assumption. So for example, if we're going to partner with NBC, and we want to show a live feed in the Netflix interface, we want to be able to display an appropriate title, an appropriate description, and an appropriate image, we might be concerned about whether or not ABC can give us appropriate metadata. So if that's one of our feasibility assumptions, we might tell our engineers, collect event data from the NBC API for 24 hours and evaluate what percentage of the time we get an appropriate title, description, and image, and what percentage of the time will we have to massage the data. Very targeted. It's going to help you collect, compare, and contrast data. How hard is it going to be to implement the solution? And an added bonus, by the time you get to delivery estimates, your estimate reliability will go way up because your engineers have investigated all the sticky points. Okay, we just covered a ton of ground really quickly. I'm going to do a 30-second recap, and then we'll turn to Q&A. So we started at the top by defining a clear outcome that represents business value. We're interviewing every week to discover and map out the opportunity space that represents customer value. We're doing that continuously because the world is always changing. When we choose a target opportunity, we're working with a set of solutions, setting up a good compare and contrast decision. And the way that we're evaluating those solutions is by identifying and testing our assumptions. I will also share every single thing that I talked about is covered in detail in my book. If you're a Collaborative Gain member, my understanding is that you are going to receive a book in your swag bag. I wrote this as a hands-on practical guide for product trios to adopt these habits. If you're a team member, the book is available around the world at major retailers like Amazon and everywhere else you might buy books. All right, Hope.
We have a number of questions and shout out to Council 11 because I've got 2 questions from Council 11. Maybe it's because they miss you so much,
Council
Teresa.
11.
Yes. Okay. The first question is from one of our newest council members, and hopefully I'm saying your name right, Dagan Orr, who just joined the council. So thank you, who's leading product at ProEdge and Astro. And her question is that their team is telling her that the product discovery has been more challenging during COVID because everybody's virtual, they're in nonstop meetings all day. So how is being in a virtual world impacting teams' ability to conduct discovery?
Yeah, really good question. I think there's some major benefits to being virtual. So I'm going to start there and then I'll get into some instances where it may be more challenging. So where I think it's been really beneficial is when we relied on in-person interviews and in-person prototype tests, we were really limited to our customers that were in our geographic region, which meant the diversity of who we were talking to was not that high. With virtual, we can talk to people all around the world and we end up covering more of our customer base. We end up understanding more of the opportunity space, and I believe we build better solutions. Now, the part of this question that really resonates is we do all live our lives on Zoom. We definitely have Zoom fatigue. Some people are working from home with kids at home, although with this fall, hopefully most of them are going back to school. It's been really challenging. And if your customers, for example, worked at airlines at the beginning of COVID, they were probably not the right people to reach out to. If your customers are nurses, I don't know when we're ever going to get to talk to nurses again, right? So we have to accept our customers' reality. And here's the general principle I'm going to give you. You need to meet your customer where they're at, which means you need to engage with them on the medium that they care about. You need to let them dictate how much time they have, and you need to make it as easy as possible for them to say yes. So for example, I worked with a team recently. Their customers are engineers. They're building an API. Most engineers that they've reached out to were not willing to get on the phone with them, but they were willing to have Slack conversations with them. And they now do the bulk of their discovery interviewing over Slack. And as long as they're asking story-based questions and collecting stories, it's perfectly fine that they're doing that over Slack. And if that's the limitation their customers want to present, they're going to meet their customers there. I've had teams conduct interviews over text messaging. I've had teams conduct interviews literally with farmers on a tractor that called them and said, hey, I'm plowing my field. I have time to talk. So the key is make it as easy as possible for your customer to say yes.
So I think the other thing, just to add in, and Hayden Paget had actually weighed in on this, which I think is also a good suggestion. It's not only just the customers and finding them where they're at, it's also making the space for your teams to have time in their schedule and protect that time for your teams, value the time that they're spending with their teams. And so Hayden shared, and you may recall we did this back in the day as well. We'd have like Discovery Thursdays where like protect a day or time of day where you're prioritizing that this is your time for customer discovery and that you're not going to overrun it with meetings.
Yeah, this meeting culture piece is a tough one. A lot of us work in organizations where we're in meetings from the moment we wake up to the moment that we end our day. If you're on a product team and that's your world, or you're a product leader and that's your team's world, here's what I literally recommend. Print out 1 week of your calendar and take a red pen and start Xing out the meetings that you absolutely do not need to be there for. And be ruthless, right? Like, here's the deal. As a product manager, it feeds your ego to be invited to all these meetings. But the reality is you don't have to be at all of them. You probably can find another way to give your input. Like, product managers don't need to sit in 2-hour bug review meetings. They just need to communicate, these are the highest priority bugs. Make sure you consider these. Leave the rest to your engineers. So that's the first thing, is if you really do need to reduce your meetings, it's going to feel like an ego hit because you want to feel important, like you need to be in every meeting. But odds are, here's the deal. If you're not talking to customers, you're not going to build a good product. So you got to find a way to protect space for that.
Yeah. We've got a number of questions I want to make sure we get to. So Ryan from Walters Kluwer, he's senior product manager for their analytics and API teams, wants to know, what if your tech team doesn't really want to be involved in customer discovery, especially weekly? That's a big ask. So what have you seen work to make sure that there's just as much enthusiasm or space or participation from all parts of the trio?
So I have 2 resources I'm going to highlight if you want to dig into this topic more, and I'll give you the cheat sheet today. So one resource is I have a blog post at Product Talk called Why Engineers Should Be Part of Your Discovery Process. You can probably just Google that. It will come right up. That's about the why it's critical to have your engineers in the process. It's getting at, why do we want that engineering mindset in the trio? And then I have a short, probably 5-minute video talking to how do you address this case where your engineers don't want to participate. The first thing, and I'll give you some highlights from that video. We've trained our engineers to be order takers. They've grown up in an IT mindset. We've told them their opinion doesn't matter. They don't trust us when we say it does now. We have to overcome like 30, 50 years of history, right? So that's the first thing. We have to work to overcome that trust. I know a lot of engineers that would rather stab their eyeballs out than talk to a customer. However, those same engineers are very opinionated about what we should be building. And so here's the key. We have to build a connection between the way we make decisions is based on what we hear from customers. If you want to have an opinion about what we're building, it has to be informed by discovery. If you make that connection, and you stick to it, more of your engineers will be interested, and you have to onboard your engineers to discovery. You can't just throw them in the deep end and say, go interview a customer, right? We got to think about easy ways to get them involved, to overcome that trust gap, and to help them get comfortable with building new skills. And you don't need all your engineers interviewing every week. You need the engineer that's participating in your trio to be part of that every week. Everybody else, they can stay focused on delivery, but make sure you're communicating what you're learning in discovery to the rest of the team as you're learning it.
That's great. Thank you, Teresa. Lauren McCadney, who's at CDW, has a question about these customer advisory boards. If you have a very large customer advisory board, how do you make sure that you don't end up designing for an unrepresentative sample who happens to make up and be a key member in your customer advisory board?
Yeah, so the first thing is when you're working with a customer advisory board, for product teams, I don't recommend you work with them as a focus group. I recommend that you actually interview your advisory board members one at a time. And that's because we can teach you how to be a good interviewer pretty easily. I already gave you the rules. Keep the interview grounded in a specific context, avoid speculation. You're going to get reliable feedback. To teach someone how to run an effective focus group is a really hard skill to teach, because now we have all these problems with group dynamics and group conformity and people dominating the conversation. So the easy thing is, if you have a customer advisory board already, invite them to participate in one-on-one interviews. The second challenge in this question is about, if we only talk to a small number of people, how do we know that we're representing the whole population? This is where the limitation of a customer advisory board is you're going to run the risk of building for a subset of your market. And when we're continuously interviewing, one of our goals is to interview a wide variety of people so we uncover more of the customer experience, right? And it's hard to do that if you're only relying on an advisory board, which is why I recommend you want to quickly try to adopt one of the other two strategies.
And I appreciate that, because I think you just also answered Mark Caltabiano's question, which is, should we be interviewing existing customers or non-customers? He's since you probably don't have an update on Mark, he's now Chief Product Officer at Maple. So congratulations, Mark, on your new role. But yeah, how do you help teams figure out who they should be interviewing?
Yeah, so when I say customers, I use the term really broadly. I mean prospects, customers, churned customers, customers who are people who match your target customer profile and may have never even heard of you. So the key qualifier for customer in my world is, do they have the attributes of the type of person that would get value from your product? That simple. So now, given a product team, who should they be talking to? It depends on their outcome, right? If their outcome is customer acquisition focused, you need to be talking to prospects and people that have never even heard of your company. If your outcome is retention focused and engagement focused, you probably can focus on current customers. So that outcome is really going to dictate who your target customer, who each product team should be talking to.
Yeah, that's why it starts at the top of the tree with that outcome, because it sets the scope for every decision and learning you need. Andy Wadwa, another Council 11, who also got something about Council 11, all these people getting new jobs and promotions. VP of Product at Freedom Financial wants to know if the concept of continuous discovery can be applied to internal platform teams, those teams building internal services or tools to speed up getting value to market.
Absolutely. So Andy, great question. Good to hear from you. Yes, in fact, internal people that have internal customers, so product teams that have internal customers, have a major advantage. Your customers are at your company, so they should be very accessible. Excuse me. And here's what I recommend. So for most product teams where their customers are outside of the building, I recommend interviewing every week, because that's the most sustainable way to to have a continuous feedback loop of opportunities. But if your customers are internal, I actually recommend you observe the way that they work every week, because observations are an even better way to discover opportunities. And so if you work on a platform team or an API team, I actually recommend you have your engineers pair program with your customer product teams and really see what it's like to use your API. If you're supporting an internal call center, I would send people on your product team to go listen in on calls live with that person over their shoulder. Now, it's COVID, most of us are working from home, so you might have to do this virtually over a Zoom call. But because you're close to your customers, I would build in observations as frequently as possible.
Thank you, Teresa. That's awesome. I want to ask another question. This one comes from Alex Rosier, who's a product marketing manager at Prediction Index, wondering if you have advice on the most effective way to ensure the findings from your discovery actually get baked into your product process and decisions every week.
Yeah, so part of the reason why I talk, so the book is all about habits. How do we start doing the right activities to make better decisions? And some of the activities are designed to help you make better decisions, right? Like comparing and contrasting, you will make a better decision if you have intellectual honesty and rigor around the compare and contrast, right? If you test your assumptions and you believe the data you get back, you will choose better solutions. But I open the book by talking about 6 key mindsets that you have to adopt. Because if you just do the habits without also starting to work on those mindsets, you're going to do all these activities and you're going to build all the same stuff you intended to build in the first place. And so some of those things are really having an experimental mindset and this sort of scientific rigor around trusting the data that you're getting back and being willing to be wrong and being willing to evolve your solution and not being stubborn about it. We got to, especially for product teams, we got to be really on guard against falling in love with our ideas and recognizing ideas are cheap. And our goal is to get to the better ideas that will create more value for both the customer and the business.
That's great. Just want to check in. I know we're at time. There are more questions. Phil and Teresa Teresa, can you stay or do you have a hard stop?
I'm happy to be
respectful.
I'm happy to keep answering questions if Phil and Brittany are okay with it.
Yeah. Phil and Brittany, are we good? Yes. Okay. We're going to keep going.
Do it.
All right. Okay. So another question is, this is from Chris Eklund at Clarivate, UX architect there, wants to know, when you've got product teams in an organization that usually starts with a solution roadmap, how do you take those first steps to establishing continuous discovery practices in that organization?
Yeah, it looks like I'm still sharing. I'm going to go back to this slide. So in an ideal world, we're starting with an outcome. I fully recognize the vast majority of us, in fact, none of us live in the ideal world, right? And it's really common to start with a solution. So here's what I'm going to recommend. If you're an individual contributor and you're starting with a solution, story map, assumption test. When you run into a faulty assumption, that's when you've learned something that your stakeholder or your boss didn't have beforehand. And you could open the conversation to, hey, I ran into a problem. Maybe we consider what else we might do. In order to do that, can we talk about what problem we're trying to solve with this solution? So you're working backwards. You found a problem with the solution, you uncover the hidden opportunity, you ask what else might we do, that starts to get you to a compare and contrast decision. If you're a leader, you have a lot more influence, right? So now we can start to say, okay, we're in an executive team, we're talking about solutions. Right then and there, I don't think you have to wait for a faulty assumption. You can start to push that conversation of how do we work our way up the tree? What customer problem do we think this is going to solve? Why do we think it's going to solve that? Is that going to drive a business outcome? What other customer problems might drive that outcome? What other solutions might we consider for that opportunity? So you can use that solution to sort of trigger this lateral thinking, both at the solution level and at the opportunity level.
Awesome. Another sort of change in the organizational culture related question from Skylar Dorison, who's a senior product manager at JustWorks. At what point does the continuous discovery inform those outcomes at the top of our tree? So we have business outcomes that we're trying to drive, but we're also learning from customers. So how do we determine what the right outcome should be, and how does that customer discovery inform it?
Yeah, really good question. So one of the frameworks in the book that I introduced is this idea of business outcomes, product outcomes, and traction metrics. At a really high level, business outcomes are going to be derived from your business model. We saw that with Netflix, with subscriber retention is tied to a subscriber business model. In fact, I could outline Netflix's business outcomes, it's probably customer acquisition, average revenue per month, and retention, right? Because that's what's really getting at lifetime value. Those are our inputs to increasing revenue. To go from there to a product outcome, we need a theory of how our product is supporting the health of the business. That's usually where we got to define some of that strategic context that Marty Kagan likes to talk about, that we know is missing in a lot of companies. We have to have a theory, a vision for our product for how it's going to support that business model. And that's often the hardest part. So sometimes that's a guess, like we're not totally sure what that should be. And so when you're kicking off a new discovery cycle, when you're giving a team a new outcome, that might be a penciled in outcome. And as your team interviews, they might learn they need to change that outcome. In fact, Hope just shared on Product Talk a story about a team that they started, they thought that they were trying to increase customer satisfaction. They were working with clinical offices. They had physicians and patient staff and front desk staff, and they were trying to improve customer satisfaction because they thought it would drive renewals. And as they interviewed, they learned that the only satisfaction score that actually drove renewals was the physician satisfaction score, and that the other two satisfaction scores had very little impact on renewal. I would argue that team should update their outcome. So every part of the tree, your outcome, the opportunity space, the solution space, is evolving as you learn throughout the discovery process.
Great. I love that example. Another question, I think Gideon had to run, but Gideon Ansell, who is director of the e-commerce user experience for Staples, asked, and he just recently rejoined the councils, when you've got product teams working on like subdomains covering like surface area of a large product or customer experience, is it better for them to like all focus on one type of customer, or somehow have the team split which types of customers they're trying to learn from if they have a common product but different moments in that product experience?
So I like to see each team have their own outcome, but they might share a customer. So if we look at Netflix, what's the Netflix journey? I have to decide I want to watch something. I have to choose Netflix. I have to decide what I'm going to watch. I have the viewing experience, and then maybe I have the post-viewing experience. Maybe I have a product team focusing on choosing what to watch, and I have a different product team focused on the playback experience, right? So they have the same customer, but they have different domains. They have different outcomes. So they each are empowered to run their own discovery process. Now, when you have adjacent teams like that, you're going to have to set the other metric as a counterbalance. So you can't tell somebody, optimize this choosing a show at the cost of the playback experience, or vice versa. They have to, so we see this a lot with like customer acquisition teams negatively impact retention because they're acquiring the wrong customers. So you might give a team a customer acquisition goal, but counterbalance it with increased customer acquisition without negatively affecting retention.
Yep. Great example. I think I'll do the last question. And this is also from Lauren McCadney at CDW, who was really interested in your thoughts on ethical design and that do no harm assumption tests. What's your perspective on whether the product team is accountable to do no harm, even if it was unintentional?
I think the vast majority of the time that we see social justice and equity issues show up in our products, and we see data abuse show up in our products, it's unintentional. So here's my question back for Lauren. If we're seeing it all the time, and most of the time it's unintentional, should we hold our teams accountable? I think if we want to create the world that we want to live in, we need to be accountable, even if it's unintentional.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think we just need help with better ways of surfacing those unintentional consequences. And I will share the one regret I have about having written this book is I wish I'd included more of that in the book. And I will be exploring that more, because here's the deal. Everybody is talking about this after 2020. And the one thing that I feel like I can do really well for product teams is take this theoretical, here's what we should do, and I'm going to help translate it into here's how to do it. That's what I did with continuous discovery habits with discovery. My goal next is to do that with this ethical question. I will share them at the very beginning of that journey. And if you know anybody who can help me with that, that's my ask for help, is please make an introduction. But I am planning to provide a lot more resources around that question because I think it's critical.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the things, if people don't know, Teresa's blog has a lot of product in practice blog posts. And again, those are great to see, like, how does this actually work for teams that are trying to change their culture, change their practices as a team. And I think that's, like, you're right, like, remembering to surface those do no harm assumptions and just making that part of your practice. May not get all of them, but to not ever try means that we get none of them. So let's try harder. Yeah. So I think that wraps it up for all the questions today that we had from our members. And Teresa, this was an awesome talk. And I know people have been sharing good feedback in the chat and excited to read more of the book and put a lot of what you shared today into practice with their teams. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for all the really great questions. And I haven't been able to keep up with the chat, but I'm hoping that Brittany will share it with me. It's been a lot of fun.
Excellent. Great work. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and staying tuned with all your great questions.